So, Lone Rider here. And you've probably heard a lot in the news about voter ID laws, especially in the run up to the election. And there seems to be everybody and their brother is trying to say that requiring ID to go vote is onerous. It's a burden. It's nobody could, well, not nobody, but there's a huge population of people that can't comply with this, and they're going to get disenfranchised, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, you have the people who say, and you know, how can you ask somebody to present ID to exercise a constitutional right? That's awful. How can you do that? Well, we've been doing it for years, actually. It's called the firearms ID card. Okay, to purchase a firearm legally, you need to have what's called a firearms ID card. To get that, you need to have a valid ID of some kind, usually a driver's license and some other stuff. There's more to it than that, but basically, you have to have ID in order to go through the process to legally get a firearm. But wait a minute, purchasing a firearm, like many other types of weapon or tool that can be used as a weapon, that's protected under the Second Amendment to our Bill of Rights, to our Constitution, right? The right to keep and bear arms, as the old saying goes, is a constitutional right. Huh. But wait a minute, it's a constitutional right that you're required to present ID in order to exercise. Why? How is that possible? These people just got done saying, well, it's awful to ask anybody to present ID in order to exercise a constitutional right. No one should do that. It's atrocious. It's disenfranchising them. It's keeping them from exercising their rights. But yet I don't hear anybody saying that about purchasing firearms. Not even the NRA is saying that. Okay. Now, there are some people, including myself, who don't like some of the draconian gun control proposals. We look at the huge negative downside for the rights of the law-abiding citizenry and the negligible to non-existent hypothetical benefit in terms of deterrent crimes, and we say to ourselves, this is a very poor trade-off. You're throwing everybody under the bus in hopes that maybe somehow, some way, without ever even knowing how, it's going to do some good. However, most people, including myself, are okay with asking somebody to present ID in order to buy a firearm. Yeah. Show they're over a certain age or that they're who they are and not maybe a convicted violent felon, whatever. The point is that, yeah, I have no problem asking for ID to buy a gun. And virtually nobody else does either. So here's the thing. It's a constitutional right. But there are some safeguards in place to make sure it's not abused by bad people. And in fact, of course, in the interim, as anybody should know, if they've been following the issue of gun control or anything related to firearms, we passed that level of safeguard a long time ago. Look 50 yards behind you, there's the line, okay? Now we're, as far as the rules for firearms are concerned, we're in total wacko crazy land. We're not in Kansas anymore. The rules for firearms in this country went beyond a handful of common sense rules a long, long time ago. And now they're just really strict and draconian. So it's not even like you just have to present ID to buy a firearm. In most places in the United States, the rules are incredibly strict. You literally have to jump through hoops while balancing a ball in your nose like a seal, right? But they're saying presenting a driver's license or non-driver ID or something in order to go vote is too arduous for most people. Look, for most people, if you're a grown adult, you have some form of ID, usually. Even if you don't drive. I mean, I'm a bicyclist. I bike a lot. I'm open to the idea that some people probably don't drive, especially in big cities or, whatever. But you know what? Most of them still have driver's licenses. If they don't, they usually get something called a non-driver ID card. And the point is they're going to have some form of ID because how else are you going to, take a book out from the library, get a movie from Netflix, open a bank account, do all these other things. It's funny what happens when these things get brought up, by the way. I brought up a couple of those examples when somebody was, declaiming how voter ID proposals were discriminatory. And I said, but think of all the other things you need ID to do. Get in a plane, get a book from the library, open a bank account. Well, maybe some people don't want a bank account, is what the response was. It's like, okay, so you went from saying that people were incapable due to some disadvantage of meeting this requirement to saying that they've chosen not to obtain ID because they don't want what you need the ID for. Never mind, I don't know who doesn't want a bank account. But anyway, assuming there's somebody out there who doesn't. Here's the deal. Okay, if you don't want a bank account, so you never get ID that would be needed in order to open a bank account, leaving aside the fact that the ID is useful for other things, but assuming you just don't want ID, or you don't want what you need the ID to do, so you just never get it. That's a choice. That's not you being disenfranchised. That's you saying, I've chosen not to do these things, so when it comes time to vote, I'm not going to have the ID. But whose fault is that? You're the one who... You see the switcheroo? They're saying, well, there's all these poor people who can't meet these requirements. But then when you say, well, yeah, but think of all the other things you would already have ID to be doing, one of them being open a bank account. Well, maybe some people don't want a bank account. I'm like, really? That's your response? So now you've shifted it, though. It's not that these people are at a disadvantage, it's that they've chosen not to get the ID. Because you didn't say, well, maybe some people can't afford to open a bank account. You said, well, maybe some people don't want a bank account. Okay. So somebody doesn't want to get the necessary ID because they don't want a bank account. So then they can't vote. They've chosen not to obtain the ID that would be necessary. Just like if I don't file for a firearms ID card, I can't legally buy a gun. Right? I try to buy a gun. I buy a gun without a firearms ID card. I'm committing a crime. Right? So, I mean, it's and then the gun comparison also trips people up. I raised that when somebody was saying. I said, well, so you don't think you should need ID to exercise a constitutional right? Okay, what about? And I gave the gun example. You need ID to buy a gun. That's a constitutional right. So what, and the person came back with, well, but guns are different because they're dangerous. Do you even think in terms of principles? Do you even, try to be consistent? Dude, the example, you were making the argument that you shouldn't need ID to exercise a constitutional right. I was simply pointing out that there are already examples of constitutional rights that you do need ID to exercise, and I gave the example of, the right to bear arms. To come back and say, well, that doesn't count because a gun's dangerous, so of course there's going to be more rules for it, is sidestepping the issue. Is it a constitutional right or not? It's in the Bill of Rights. It's a constitutional right. If you're going to make the argument, well, you shouldn't have to have ID to exercise a constitutional right, like voting, for example, okay, then where do you stand on having to get ID to buy a gun? Because it's the same thing. So either you should be allowed to ask for ID, if you're going to ask people for ID to buy guns, which most everyone supports, including myself. You should be okay with asking people for ID to vote because they're both constitutional rights. On the other hand, if you think it's discriminatory and it's disenfranchising people and it's keeping them from exercising their rights, to ask them for a mundane piece of ID that most of them already have, probably, then you should certainly be against asking ID, the same level of ID to purchase a firearm, and you should certainly be against any of the more intrusive things like having to get a specific firearms ID card, etc. So what this is about, this isn't about guns. This isn't even about voting. It's about consistency. Are you willing to stand by a principle and say it applies across the board? Or are you just going to try and pick and choose? And when anybody corners you with an example of the same thing in a different similar but different applicable case, are you going to turn around and say, oh, but that's different. Oh, but that's different. Oh, but that's different. No, they're the same. At the level of being a constitutional right, they're the same. The issue isn't what type of constitutional right it is. Does it refer to buying a weapon? Does it refer to freedom of speech? Does it refer to freedom of assembly? Does it refer to voting? That's not the issue. The issue simply, is it a constitutional right? Because you never said, well, they shouldn't be allowed to ask for ID for voting because it's a constitutional right that doesn't involve weapons. No, you simply said you shouldn't be allowed to ask for ID for voting because it's a constitutional right. Well, if that's the case, then I shouldn't be able to find any other example of a constitutional right where you have to ask for ID. But guess what? There's at least one, and we know it's the gun example. And the disingenuousness is really, when all else fails, they just say, oh, you must be a racist. You must be a bigot. You must want to discriminate against people. Oh, no, I just want to make sure that, like all that meddling in elections that everybody in the media has been talking about for 2 years now, at least. I want to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen. All those dead people that you hear stories about, dead people's names on voting rolls and whatnot. I want to make sure that doesn't happen. Somebody voting twice or 3 times, or voting again or whatever, voting in more than one jurisdiction. People who shouldn't be here, maybe let's say are here illegally, or otherwise not entitled to vote. Certain convicted felons, etc., voting when they shouldn't. The wanting to know that when I go to the trouble to cast my vote, that it's not going to be watered down by votes that shouldn't be there in the first place, that's not an unreasonable thing. I'm doing my part by voting. I just want the system to do its part. The system. But yeah, I want the election system in this country to do its part by making sure that myself and everybody else who's voting is doing so in an above board manner. Look, the voting booth is like 2 blocks from my house, the polling place where we usually vote. I usually either walk over or ride my bicycle. I usually, when I go, I do something that I never do normally, as a rule, while riding my bicycle. I carry my wallet with me. Why? Because it's got my driver's license in it, which is not necessary for walking around or riding a bicycle, but would be necessary if somebody asked me to show identification. I don't normally go out of my way to carry that while riding my bike. If I have it with me, I have it with me. If I don't, I don't. Because it's a bicycle. You don't need a driver's license for a bicycle. But here's the thing. If I'm going to be riding my bike to the voting booth, these past few years I've carried it with me, just in case. Why? I figured there was all this talk about voter ID, and sooner or later somebody would ask me to prove that I'm me. And you know what? Frankly, if they did, I would actually feel more comfortable with the election results. Right? Elections vary in this country. Sooner or later, somebody that you approve of or that you disapprove less of is going to win. But likewise, sooner or later, somebody that you're terrified of or that you really disapprove of is also going to win. When the election results, sometimes they go the way you want, sometimes they don't. There are so many variables. But when the election results don't go the way you want, at least if you can know that it was fair and square, that you didn't get cheated, that every vote was counted. Every legal vote, that is. And no more. Not one more. That's all people are asking for who support these things. I'm sure there's also a handful of self-serving politicians who are looking at it, and just like with the gerrymandering of districts, are probably looking at it with an eye to, well, what can we do to give our party an advantage? But the average person who supports the idea of asking for ID to get to go vote, it's not about racism or discriminating against people. I mean, you have to show ID to get an airplane or take out a book from the library. Are American Airlines or the public library racist or discriminatory? No, nobody says that. You have to use your little ShopRite card to get a discount at the supermarket. Is ShopRite bigoted? No. In no other area of life is showing ID considered disenfranchising people or discriminating them or targeting them. It's just something that everybody's required to do, and most people do it. And if you don't, then you don't. And somebody well might say, again, these examples, getting on a plane, taking out a library book, getting a supermarket discount, opening a bank account. These aren't constitutional rights. That's exactly true. But they are things that most people do over the course of their daily lives without being markedly inconvenienced, right? I don't say to myself, well, it's too much trouble to get the ShopRite ID card, and I'll be damned if I'm going to get gypped out of that 5-cent savings. So you know what? I'm just going to not buy food, go home, and starve to death. Nobody says that, right? They either buy the stuff without the discount, or they go and they apply for one of them little card thingies. It's never like, well, you're discriminating against me. So again, I'm not going to buy food. I'll just go home and starve. Nobody does that. Okay? What do you think if they asked for ID to vote? What do you think would happen? Do you think people would say, well, no way, I'm not doing that. I just won't vote. No. People will present the ID and go vote. And you know what? Most people have the ID already. Again, they talk about this like there's a huge number of people out there that don't have ID. There may be some, don't get me wrong, there may be some, especially if you've fallen at hard times and maybe you no longer have a bank account. Maybe your driver's license expired. Maybe you got evicted and you don't even have an address. But the point is, for most people, the vast majority of people, there's nothing arduous about presenting some form of ID. And the critics of voter ID talk about this as if it's some sort of conspiracy to disenfranchise people. No, I just want to know, I'm going to the trouble to vote, that the government is going to the trouble to make sure that my vote, I'm not getting cheated out of my vote. And again, it's disingenuous to say, well, how dare you ask somebody to present ID to exercise a constitutional right? Okay, well, what about buying a firearm? You have to present ID to do that. Oh, no, you don't. Anybody can just walk into a store and buy an Uzi. They either say that or they say, well, that's different because guns are weapons and they're dangerous. So, of course, there's more rules for that. Yes, a gun is a weapon. A vote isn't. But the issue isn't what is dissimilar between the two. The issue is what's the same. What's the same is that they're both constitutional rights. What does that mean? If it's reasonable to ask people for ID before they buy a firearm, not because you're trying to keep them from exercising their Second Amendment rights, but simply as a basic safeguard against bad people abusing that right. Why is it so unreasonable to ask people for ID to vote? Again, they're both constitutional rights. Sidetracking it with, well, that's a weapon, and then this isn't. Yes, so they're both still constitutional rights. Your point was that you shouldn't have to present ID to exercise your constitutional rights. Now, all of a sudden, it's not about constitutional rights. It's about the fact that guns are weapons and votes aren't. And by the way, a miscreant with a firearm can only harm whoever's in front of him. If, for whatever reason, the government goes down the road of wrong policy, an unconstitutional or a wrong-headed government policy could cause much more widespread harm than whatever immediate physical danger can be inflicted by one miscreant with a gun. One miscreant with a gun can only hurt however many people he personally comes in contact with in a given instance before he's taken into custody or killed. A whole bunch of people voting who aren't supposed to could do unmitigated harm into the future. Again, all this talk of election meddling, whether or not you believe in the way that's being presented and if it's accurate or not, the point is there are people who are afraid right now that elections are being deliberately tampered with. Is it that hard to believe then that there might be some people who, on a much smaller scale, are doing something they shouldn't be doing? And to say that, well, no, it's really just about discriminating against people. Did you ever hear the old expression, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras? In other words, look for the most logical thing rather than the most outlandish thing. I mean, if people are saying we need to ask for ID because we're concerned there might be voter fraud, maybe that really is the reason, rather than some made-up reason you're twisting everything to try and come up with. it just amazes me. And especially since, you know, again, whenever you try to point out examples that contradict what they're saying, well, hey, but you're saying you don't need you shouldn't need ID to exercise a constitutional right. So when are you going to start arguing for removing all those gun laws? Oh, no, we would never do that. Well, but you just said you shouldn't need ID to exercise. Oh, I see. You only care about some rights. It's good to know that. You should have said that up front. Would have saved everybody a lot of trouble. Right? Oh, and I want to touch on one last thing. The people who say that, well, it's just about a handful of Republicans who want to, keep in office and try to use this to their advantage. If you're making the argument that there's an ulterior motive and that Republican politicians are supporting voter ID laws simply to try and tilt the deck in their favor, then what you're also saying at the same time is that the only reason Democratic politicians oppose such laws is to try and keep their advantage. Right? Accusations of ulterior motives cut both ways. If the whole idea is that these laws would benefit Republicans by discriminating, or so they say, then the real reason for Democrats opposing it, it could be that they care about alleged discrimination, or it could be that, well, if they're going on the premise that these laws will benefit Republicans, then they're simply opposing them out of their own self-interest. And it has nothing to do with whether or not they discriminate, or whether or not anybody, opposing voter ID laws would even care if they did. Let's remember that we're talking politicians here. From one party to the other, there are definite policy position differences, but as far as morals are concerned, they're politicians, right? They're fickle creatures of the political whims of the moment. They're not in it to make this a better world, if you know what I'm saying. So, yeah, it's quite possible there are people who are trying to exploit this, like with the gerrymandering of districts and other things, for their own political advantage. But that cuts both ways. If you're going to say, well, the Republicans are only supporting these, it has nothing to do with voter fraud. They just want to get an advantage. By the flip side, then the only reason the Democrats would be supporting it is to try and maintain their advantage. So, at least be honest about that, right? That maybe there really is no high-minded, if it's not about actual concerns about voter fraud, then it's not about discrimination either. It's just about self-serving politicians. But for a lot of us, there is a real concern about voter fraud. Again, I'm going to the trouble to do my part and vote and tell everybody I know to vote and my friends to vote and my family to vote. Myself and all of these other people, we just want to know that the government's doing its part to make sure that our votes count and they're not diluted or watered down with bogus votes. And, they are bogus. I'm sorry, but if you're not supposed to be voting, you're not supposed to be voting. Every vote should count. Every legal vote, that is. And not one more. What's wrong with arguing that? Lone Rider out.